Now, coming to the second perspective on the why and where of international human rights, I'd like to introduce what could, by contrast to the positive affirmation of values, be thought of as a negative affirmation or a denunciation, a rejection of particular practices that are seen to be illegitimate, abusive, or inconsistent with human rights. As we have noted, the very articulation of human rights standards derives from, to a large extent at least, from the mobilization of people for particular causes in particular times and particular political and social circumstances. This, as we've seen, was true of anti-slavery movements, labor movements, civil rights movements, anti-apartheid movements, women's rights movements, and many, many others. In all of these examples, we see illustration of how human rights are a product or a legacy of struggle. The South African human rights expert Christoph Heinz once developed what he called a struggle theory of human rights and stated or suggested that every human rights, as recognized in the international legal framework, is the flip side of the coin of a fighting cause. This is a very appealing and evocative idea, which in fact might help people differently positioned in different parts of the world to associate with and embrace the human rights framework, to feel its utility and relevance in their own circumstances and contexts. However, I don't think it's the full picture. In addition to the struggle that's undertaken by particular groups, by people particularly affected, there's a need for their claims to resonate with society at large, to be taken up by opinion leaders and politicians or philosophers, civil society organizations, and packaged or established as core principles of how society should organize itself going forward. This indeed has happened in all of the examples, all of the cases that I've just mentioned. What we see here is how human rights are fundamentally embedded in history, how human rights emerge from historical experience, and in particular from historical experience of something that constitutes a threshold, of something that is wrong and that has to be righted looking forward. If one takes this idea or perspective and applies it not just to particular human rights claims, but to the human rights framework as such, one can see the human rights framework as the emergence of, or one can see the human rights framework as a reaction to a comprehensive situation of wrongs in the past, a comprehensive societal flaw, one might say. This is exactly how human rights were thought about in the aftermath of the Second World War. The international community looked at the atrocities of the war, looked at the way in which modern technologies and the organization of mass mobilization of armies and of people led to the destruction of human life, the violation and the destruction of property. Interestingly, this perspective on human rights as embedded in history, as emerging from historical experience, can be applied not just to particular rights, as we've done a moment ago, but also to the entire human rights framework. This is exactly what happened at the end of the Second World War. During and after the war, people looked with dismay at the way in which the most advanced technologies were used for destructive purposes, to slaughter and murder people on a mass scale, and to destroy property, to destroy societies. The Holocaust came to epitomize this. It was a systematic, deliberate genocide perpetrated by industrial means. It was seen as the quintessential violation and disregard for the dignity of the human person. And in response to this, the world said no. The world said, never again. We cannot allow this to repeat itself in the future. We cannot allow anything similar to occur in the future. How do we prevent this? How do we ensure this? We do it by making a historical break, by starting a new epoch. And that epoch is defined precisely by the values that denounce, that contrast the wrongs that were perpetrated and prevalent in the past. So the confrontation with wrongs in the past becomes an affirmation of a new moral, social and legal order. And this is exactly what the International Human Rights Framework was intended to accomplish. One sees a similar way of approaching and relating to the past in the anti-apartheid movement, and in particular in the way in which the apartheid legacy was processed in South Africa after 1994. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission confronting wrongs in the past, denouncing them, and on that basis forging a new social, moral and political order that would be inclusive, respectful of all members of society, all races, all ethnic groups, and this is what we have come to think of as the Rainbow Nation. Processing of the historical experience of this regard has been undertaken in the framework of transitional justice in many other parts of the world. It was done in Latin America in response to the experience of military dictatorships, where Nunca Más reports were intended to establish a platform for society to move forward, always premised on a shared affirmation of the inherent dignity of the human person and the wider legal framework centered around principles of human rights. In processing historical experience in this way, there's one particular question which I think we also need to raise, which is which histories, whose experience counts? In many ways, the human rights framework has been successful in reacting to the most egregious and atrocious wrongs in the past, but there may be particular groups that feel nevertheless disregarded, overlooked, not accorded sufficient attention. An important example of this is found in feminist criticisms of the International Human Rights Framework articulated, let's say, in the 1980s, 1990s, into the new millennium. It has been held in this connection that the experience, that the subject of human rights is inherently gendered, inherently male. The experience of women, and the experience is in particular of abuse of women in society, in armed conflict, and in a variety of, in the domestic setting, and in communities in some regards, has not been accorded sufficient focus, emphasis and attention by the International Human Rights Framework. This has been taken seriously and must be taken seriously, and I think has in some regards also been, if not corrected, then at least ameliorated in subsequent developments, resolutions of the UN Security Council on Women, Peace and Security, for example, and in other regards. But nevertheless, there may be a way to go to ensure that the existing normative and legal framework is responsive to the way in which different groups are positioned in society in the current era. The same thing could be said of descendants of slaves, and has been said, or for that matter, people inhabiting countries that were former colonies, and in that connection being exploited, oppressed and abused, with continuing effects on society today. The World Conference in Durban in 2001 against racism, xenophobia and other forms of intolerance and discrimination, certain groups try to establish the idea of reparations for wrongs perpetrated in the framework of colonialism as a central challenge for the international community. This is not just a matter of making economic compensations, reparations. it's also a matter of recognition of historical experience in a way that the existing international law framework is perceived to be responsive to the experience of people differently positioned in the contemporary world order. A final perspective in this connection may be linked with the persistence of poverty on a mass scale in many parts of the world today. Are there ways in which the international human rights framework is insufficiently responsive to a historical legacy of affluence co-producing poverty? If that's the case, human rights again need to take the challenge on board and evolve in ways that react to these concerns.